He tried to sell his own daughter for a bottle of whiskey. Not in secret, not in shame, right there in the middle of the street, in front of half the town, with the sun beating down and the dust still swirling around his boots. 19 years old, and Clara Whitmore stood there listening to her father negotiate her future like she was a broken-down horse nobody wanted. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just stood completely still, and that stillness, that silence, was the most terrifying thing anyone in Delwood, Wyoming had ever witnessed. This is her story. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Delwood, Wyoming, the way bad news always does, without warning and without mercy. By the middle of July, the sky had turned the color of old bone, and the creek that ran behind the Whitmore property had shrunk down to a thin brown ribbon crawling between cracked mud banks. The grass in the fields had given up entirely, gone brittle and pale, and the heat pressed down on everything and everyone like a flat iron left too long on cloth. It was the kind of summer that made men do things they'd regret, or in Roy Whitmore's case, things he wouldn't regret at all, because regret required a conscience, and Roy had spent most of his drinking away at the Broken Spur Saloon. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard his boots on the porch steps. She knew the sound of those boots, the way she knew the sound of a storm rolling in. There was a particular rhythm to them, a certain uneven stumble, a drag on the left foot where his knee had never healed right after the fall from the barn roof 4 years ago. When she heard that drag in the afternoon hours, before supper, before dark, she knew he'd been at the whiskey since noon. She kept her hands moving, shirt, pin, shirt, pin. Clara. His voice came from behind her, rough and loose. Leave that. Come inside. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished pinning the shirt she was holding, slowly, carefully, smoothing the collar flat even though it didn't need smoothing. It was a small thing, that pause. But it was hers. Then she turned. Roy Whitmore was not a big man, but he had a way of taking up space that had nothing to do with his size. He was lean in the way of men who eat irregularly and drink regularly, his face weathered to deep lines around the eyes and mouth, his beard patchy and unkempt. He was 43 years old and looked 60. He was squinting at her the way he always squinted, like the sight of her mildly irritated him. Inside, he said again. Got someone coming. Who? Harlan Beach. Clara felt her stomach drop about 2 inches. Harlan Beach owned the livery stable on the east end of town and 300 acres of flat, dry land that produced very little except dust. He was 51, twice widowed, and had a reputation for being mean to animals. Clara had been aware for the past year that he sometimes watched her when she came into town. Not the way young men watched, which was uncomfortable enough, but with a flat, assessing quality, like he was calculating something. What does he want? She asked, though some part of her already knew. We're going to talk, Roy said. Just a conversation. You come in, you sit down, you be polite. Papa, don't start. He turned and went back inside, the screen door banging shut behind him. Clara stood in the heat for a moment with a wet shirt in her hands. A meadowlark called somewhere out in the dead grass. The sound of it was almost obscene, too bright, too pretty for the afternoon she felt coming. She went inside. Harlan Beach arrived 20 minutes later riding a gray gelding that looked as miserable as its owner. He tied the horse to the post out front and came through the door without knocking, the way men with a certain kind of confidence always entered rooms they considered already half theirs. He was broader than Clara remembered, wide in the shoulders, thick through the middle, with close-set eyes and a jaw that worked constantly even when he wasn't chewing anything. Roy had set out a bottle on the kitchen table, already a third gone. Clara, Roy said, waving a hand at the chair across from him. Sit down. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She watched. The two men talked around her for a while the way men did. About the heat, about the failing creek levels, about some dispute over fencing on the north road. Clara kept her eyes on the table. She could hear in her father's voice the particular looseness that meant he was already past the point where she could appeal to him. Not that appealing to Roy Whitmore had ever done much good, even when he was sober. Then Harlan Beach leaned back in his chair and looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down, and he said, She's quieter than I expected. She's quiet, Roy agreed. Doesn't give trouble. Clara kept her hands folded. She looked at the grain of the wood on the table. "I've got a practical situation," Harlan said, addressing Roy now rather than her, as though she'd already excused herself from the room. "I need someone to run the house. Cook, clean, manage the stock accounts. My place is going to ruin without a woman in it." He paused. "She looks capable enough." "She is," Roy said. He poured himself another measure. "Smart girl. Knows numbers." "I'm not looking for a hired hand," Harlan said. He picked up his glass. "I'm looking for a wife, or close enough." And there it was. The word hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a wet fire, not quite forming into something solid, but thick enough to choke on. Clara looked up then. She looked at her father. Roy was not looking at her. He was studying the label on the whiskey bottle with the careful attention of a man who has decided not to notice certain things. "What are the terms?" Roy asked. Clara heard the blood moving in her own ears. Terms, like she was a parcel of land, like she was the gray gelding out front. "I'll clear your debt at the Broken Spur," Harlan said. $23, I believe it stands at, and I'll give you 15 cash on top of that. 20? Roy said. 17. Done. Clara pushed back from the table. The chair scraped the floor loud as a gunshot, and both men finally looked at her. "No," she said. Roy's eyes went flat. "Clara, I said no." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was standing now without quite remembering getting to her feet. I'm not for sale. I'm not going anywhere with him." "You don't have a choice in this," Roy said, and his voice had gone quiet in that particular way that had always frightened her more than his shouting. Quiet was dangerous. Quiet meant he'd already decided. "I'm 19, she said. "I'm not a child anymore. You can't—" "I can do whatever I want," he said. "You live under my roof. You eat my food. You'll do what I tell you." Harlan Beach was watching this exchange with the mild interest of a man who has already gotten what he came for and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He was not alarmed by her protest. He was not moved by it. He looked at her the way you'd look at a horse that shied from the saddle. An inconvenience, nothing more, something that would be managed. "I will not go," Clara said again. "Then you'll go hungry," Roy said, "because I'm done feeding a girl who won't pull her weight." Atiet. She didn't know what she would have done next. Run, maybe. Or stood there until the situation collapsed under its own ugliness. Or said something she couldn't take back that would have landed her on the street that evening with nothing. She never found out, because the screen door opened. None of them had heard the horse approach. None of them had heard boots on the porch steps. But the door opened, and a man stepped into the kitchen doorway, and the whole shape of the afternoon changed. Clara had seen Wade Callahan around Delwood before. Everyone had. He was one of those men you noticed without meaning to. Not because he was particularly handsome or particularly loud, but because he carried himself with a kind of settled weight that made rooms feel different when he entered them. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the chest and lean everywhere else, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had seen too much sun and not enough rest. His eyes were the gray-green of creek water in early spring. He had been widowed 2 years ago. Everybody knew that too. His wife, Nell, had died of fever the winter before last, leaving him alone with 3 sons and a working ranch and a grief he kept quiet enough that the town had collectively decided to respect it. Clara had spoken maybe 15 words to him in her entire life. He stood in the doorway, now looking at the 3 of them, the bottle on the table, the 2 men, and Clara standing with her hands balled at her sides. And he read the situation in about 4 seconds. "Roy," he said. His voice was level. "I came to talk about that fence line on the south quarter, the boundary dispute." He paused. "But I can come back another time." He said it neutrally. But his eyes were on Clara's face, and they stayed there a beat too long, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has learned to read rooms to survive, that he had heard some of what had been said. Maybe all of it. "No, stay," Roy said, the hospitality coming on reflexively the way it did with men who wanted witnesses to their respectability. "Sit down. Have a drink." "I'm fine standing," Wade said. There was a silence. Harlan Beach shifted in his chair. Roy picked up his glass and set it down again. We were in the middle of something, Harlan said, addressing Wade directly with a tone that was meant to be dismissive. Private matter. I can see that, Wade said. He still wasn't moving. His eyes moved from Clara to Roy, and something shifted very slightly in his expression, something that wasn't quite anger, but was close enough to it. Clara. He said her name like he was acknowledging her presence in a room full of people who had been trying to erase it. You all right? Nobody had asked her that. The question was so simple and so unexpected that it took her a full moment to respond. Her throat felt strange. No, she said. I'm not. Roy slapped his hand flat on the table. This is none of your business, Callahan. Your daughter is 19 years old, Wade said, and his voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it made Roy's sentence stop in its tracks. She's sitting here looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. And you're discussing terms. He looked at Harlan. With him. Harlan Beach stood up. He was a big man, and he meant the standing to be a statement. I said this is private, he said, and I said I can see that. Wade didn't move. He looked at Roy. Roy, is this what you're doing? Settling your bar tab on the back of your own daughter? Roy's face went red. What I do with my family is my... Then let her go, Wade said. Simple as that. 4 words. Let her walk out of here and we'll all act like this conversation never happened. She's got nowhere to go, Roy said, and Clara heard in it the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has cornered something. Wade was quiet for a moment. She can come to my ranch, he said. The kitchen went completely still. Clara stared at him. Roy stared at him. Even Harlan Beach, who was not a man given to surprise, stared at him. I need help with the house, Wade said, and his voice was measured, practical, as though he was talking about hiring someone to reshingle a barn. Meals, mending, keeping the books. I've got 3 boys and no one to manage the household, and I've been looking for a housekeeper for 6 months. I'm offering a job. A room. Fair wages. He looked at Clara directly. That's all I'm offering, nothing else. You'd have your own space and your own say. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. You can't be serious, Harlan said. I'm completely serious, Wade said. He was still looking at Clara. What do you say? What did she say? She looked at her father. Roy was watching her with that flat-eyed expression, and she could see behind it, not anger, not love, but something simpler and uglier. Calculation. He was calculating whether this was better or worse for him than the deal he'd already struck. He made no move to stop her. She looked at Harlan Beach, who was already beginning to reassemble his dignity after the humiliation of being turned down in front of witnesses, straightening his jacket and setting his jaw. She looked at Wade Callahan, standing in her father's doorway like he'd wandered in by accident and stayed on purpose. Yes, she said. She packed in 11 minutes. She knew exactly what she was taking before she even went upstairs, because she had always, in some compartment of herself she rarely opened, kept a mental inventory of what she'd carry if she ever had to leave fast. Her mother's quilt. 3 dresses, her writing box with the ink and the 2 books inside it. A tattered almanac and a copy of David Copperfield whose cover had fallen off years ago. Her mother's small silver brooch that Roy had never noticed or sold, a miracle in itself. She came back downstairs with a canvas bag and a flour sack tied at the top. Roy was still at the table. He wasn't looking at her. He was pouring another drink. Harlan Beach was gone. She hadn't heard him leave. Papa, she said. He didn't look up. Papa, I'm going. I know, he said. He took a drink. Go on then. She stood there for a moment, not because she wanted him to stop her, but because some instinct kept looking for something in his face that had never been there. Some flicker. Some crack. There was nothing. She turned and walked out. Wade Callahan's wagon was tied at the road gate. He was checking the harness when she came through, not looking at her approach, giving her the small privacy of arriving on her own terms. She came up beside the wagon and stood there, and he looked at her. You sure? He said. Yes, she said. All right. He took her bags without making a ceremony of it and stowed them behind the seat. It's about 40 minutes out to the ranch. You can ride up front or in the back, whichever you prefer. Front, she said. She climbed up. He came around and climbed up on his side. He released the brake and flicked the reins, and the horses moved forward, and just like that, the house where Clara Whitmore had lived her entire life disappeared behind a turn in the road. She didn't look back. She wanted to. The pull was enormous. Not because she loved the place, but because she was afraid that if she looked back, she might see something that would break her nerve. Her father on the porch, maybe. Or just the house standing there ordinary and indifferent, as though nothing had happened at all. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. The wagon wheels made a particular sound on the dry, packed dirt. The horses' hooves were steady and unhurried. A hot wind came off the flats to the west and pushed the dust sideways. After a while, Wade said, "I should tell you. My boys don't know you're coming." Clara looked at him. "I didn't plan this," he said, and there was an honesty to the admission that was almost startling. Most men would have felt compelled to frame it better. "I came to your father's place to talk about the fence, and He stopped. "I heard what was happening, through the door." A pause. "I'm sorry you were in that situation." "You don't have to apologize," Clara said. "You didn't create it." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "But you should know. The offer is real. I've got a working ranch and 3 boys and more chaos than one man can manage, and I do need the help. I'm not asking you to be grateful for something I didn't plan." Clara looked at his profile. He was watching the road with the focused attention of a man accustomed to silences. "How old are your boys?" she asked. "Eli's 14, Hector is 11, Sammy just turned 8. And they don't know about me. Not yet." She absorbed this. 3 boys, no warning, and a house full of accumulated grief. It was a complicated situation by any measure. "What was your wife like?" Clara asked, and then immediately regretted the directness of it. "I'm sorry, you don't have to." "No, it's all right." He was quiet for a moment. "She was practical, smart. She kept the place running better than it deserved to be run. She was funny when you weren't expecting it." Another pause. "She's been gone 2 years, and the house still doesn't work right without her." Clara nodded slowly. She understood, more than he likely expected her to, what it meant when a house stopped working. "I'll try not to make it worse," she said. He glanced at her, a quick sideways look, and something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite read. "I don't think you will," he said. The Callahan Ranch sat at the base of a long sloping rise, backed up against a line of cottonwoods that marked where the creek ran deeper and more reliably than anywhere else in the valley. The house was larger than Clara had expected. 2 stories, clapboard, once painted white that had weathered to a tired gray cream. A good barn, red, in better shape than the house. Several outbuildings, a well, a kitchen garden that had been left mostly to its own devices and was managing in an untidy, determined way. There was a boy sitting on the porch steps when the wagon came up the drive. He was the oldest one. Had to be Eli, the 14-year-old, lanky and dark-haired like his father, with his elbows on his knees and a look on his face that teenagers throughout history have deployed when they are pretending not to care about something that they very much care about. He watched the wagon approach with the casual surveillance of someone who has decided in advance to be unimpressed. He looked at Clara. His eyes moved to the bags in the back of the wagon. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Wade set the brake and climbed down. "Eli, who is she?" No greeting, no preamble, straight to it. "Her name is Clara Whitmore. She's going to be helping with the house for a while." "We don't need help with the house." "The house strongly disagrees," Wade said. His voice was patient in a way that suggested he'd had this conversation in some form many times before. "Where are your brothers?" "Backfield." Eli was still looking at Clara, not with hostility exactly, but with a wariness that was almost animal. The look of someone who has learned that changes in the household usually mean something bad. Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help and stood on the packed dirt of the drive. She looked at Eli directly. She did not smile at him the way adults smile at children they want something from. That bright, slightly desperate smile that children always see straight through. "Hello," she said. Just that. Eli looked at her for a long moment. "Hello," he said back. Flat, non-committal. But he said it. That was something. The inside of the house was She found the right word for it on the walk through: neglected. Not filthy, not entirely, but neglected the way things get when the person who cared for them most is gone, and everyone else is doing their best, and their best isn't quite enough. Dishes washed but stacked impractically, windows filmed with dust, a kitchen that had things in the wrong places, drawers jammed with items that belonged in other drawers, a pantry that had been organized by someone who couldn't quite remember how Nell had organized it and had eventually stopped trying. The grief was in the details. It always was. Clara set her bags down in the room Wade showed her, a small room on the ground floor, off the kitchen, that had been used for storage and still held the shadows of that function. Some old crates pushed against one wall, a narrow bed with a clean but musty quilt. The window looked out at the cottonwoods. It was the first room that had been entirely hers. She stood in the middle of it and breathed for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and started figuring out where things were. The younger boys came in at dusk, Hector at 11, square-jawed and watchful, and Sammy at 8, who was gap-toothed and dirty from the field and who stopped dead in the kitchen doorway and stared at Clara with the wide-open curiosity that only very young children and very old people can get away with. "Who are you?" Sammy said. "Clara," she said. "I'm going to be staying here for a while." "In our house?" "In your house. Is that all right with you?" Sammy considered this with genuine deliberation, the kind that suggested he was a child who took questions seriously. "Do you know how to make cornbread?" he asked. "I do?" "Mama's cornbread had honey in it." "I can do that." Sammy nodded slowly as though this settled something significant. "Okay," he said, and wandered past her toward the stairs. Hector lingered in the doorway. He was studying her with a more guarded expression than his brother. The middle child's particular brand of surveillance, she thought. He'd watched how Eli reacted and decided to process his own reaction separately. "You from town?" he asked. "Yes." "Why are you here?" "Your father offered me a job." "He didn't say anything about it this morning?" "No," she agreed. It came up suddenly. Hector absorbed this. His eyes moved around the kitchen, took in the fact that she'd organized the counter, moved the water jug to where it made more sense, started something in the pot over the stove. "Eli's not going to be happy about it," he said. "Not as a threat, as information, delivered with a kind of fairness." "I got that sense," Clara said. "He's like that with everything new," Hector said. He looked at her again, and something in his expression was almost apologetic. "It usually wears off." "I'll try to be patient," she said. Hector nodded and went upstairs. Clara turned back to the stove and stood there in the gathering dark, listening to the sounds of the house. Boots on the floorboards above her, a door, voices, the particular creak of the second stair from the top. And she understood that she was somewhere completely new and probably in over her head and possibly making one of the biggest mistakes of her life. She also understood in a quieter and more stubborn way that it was still better. Better than where she'd been. Better than where she was headed. She stirred the pot. Outside, through the kitchen window, the cottonwood leaves caught the last of the evening light and turned silver, and the first star appeared low in the deep blue above the ridgeline, and the heat of the day finally, slowly, began to let go. Wade came in from his barn at full dark, washing his hands at the pump outside before he came through the door. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Almost the same doorway he'd stood in at her father's house, she thought, but different in every way that mattered, and looked at the table set for 5, and the pot on the stove, and the counter where things had been moved into a more logical order. He looked at Clara. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "I was going to eat supper regardless," she said. "Not much more work to make 5 servings than 1. He was quiet for a moment. "How'd they take it?" he asked. "The boys." "Eli's reserving judgment," she said carefully. "Hector's willing to wait and see. Sammy's interested in whether I can match his mother's cornbread recipe." Wade gave a short, low sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Restrained, like he hadn't quite decided if it was appropriate. He sat down at the table. He looked tired in the way of men who have been tired for so long it has become their normal. "I'll talk to Eli," he said. "You don't have to," Clara said. She ladled stew into the bowls. "He's allowed to take his time. I'm the stranger who showed up in his house without warning. His skepticism is reasonable." Wade looked at her with that sideways look again. Most people would be offended, he said. Most people need things to be easier than they are, she said. I'm not most people. She set a bowl in front of him. He looked down at it, then up at her, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't fully read. Something careful and quiet, like a door that has been shut for a long time, standing very slightly ajar. Thank you, he said. It was simple, but he said it like he meant it. Clara sat down. She unfolded her napkin. From upstairs came the sound of 3 sets of feet thumping toward the staircase, and Sammy's voice rising above the others in what sounded like an argument about whose turn it was to feed the chickens in the morning, and Hector's response, and then Eli's, quieter and more measured, the voice of the oldest child who has learned that he needs to keep things together when the adults can't. Clara looked at the empty chair beside her, the one that hadn't been pulled out, the one nobody had sat in since Nell, and she did not say anything about it. She picked up her spoon. Dinner was ready. The boys were coming down the stairs. Whatever came next, and she understood very clearly that plenty of things were coming, none of them simple. It would have to start here. With a bowl of stew in a borrowed house at the edge of a dry and difficult summer, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of someone else's memory. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and Clara Whitmore had built things out of less. The first week nearly broke her, not because the work was too hard. Clara had never been a stranger to hard work. She had cooked and cleaned and mended and hauled water since she was old enough to be useful, which in Roy Whitmore's household meant since she was about 5. She knew how to wake before the sun and keep moving until well after it had set. That part she could manage. What nearly broke her was the silence. Not an empty silence. The house was never empty, never quiet for long with 3 boys moving through it. But the particular loaded silence of people who have not decided yet what to make of you. Eli came to meals, ate, answered direct questions in as few words as possible, and disappeared. Hector watched her from a middle distance with that careful, measuring look of his, not unfriendly, but not warm, cataloging everything she did and filing it away somewhere she couldn't access. Even Sammy, who had shown the most initial openness, pulled back after the first day when he realized that accepting her too easily might be a kind of betrayal to something he couldn't yet name. Wade was present and decent and tired in a way that had become structural, built into the foundation of him. He thanked her for meals. He paid her at the end of the first week without her having to ask, which was more than she'd expected. He answered her practical questions about the house and the ranch with patience and accuracy. But he kept his distance too, and Clara understood that was its own kind of communication. He had done something impulsive and kind, and now both of them were living inside the consequences of it, feeling out the shape of an arrangement that had no established rules. She gave them all their space. She did the work. She kept her door closed at night and her opinions to herself on most things. And she was careful, very careful, not to move anything in the house that she hadn't thought through first. Nell Callahan's absence was a presence in every room. Her absence was the arrangement of the furniture, the placement of the dried flowers on the windowsill, the hook by the back door where her apron still hung. Clara stepped around all of it the way you step around a bruise you can see forming. It was on the 8th day that the first real crack appeared. She was in the kitchen after supper, going over the ledger Wade had left on the counter, a battered thing, poorly organized, with entries written in 3 different hands, when she heard boots on the stairs coming down too fast, and then Hector's voice, lower and quieter than his usual register, saying something she couldn't make out, and then Eli's voice, sharp and clear. She shouldn't be touching Mama's things. Clara went still. She heard Wade's voice from somewhere upstairs. A low rumble, the words indistinct. She moved the pitcher, Eli said, from the blue shelf. Mama always kept it on the blue shelf. Clara looked at the pitcher. She had moved it 4 days ago, from the high blue shelf where it was essentially decorative and out of reach, down to the counter near the basin where it was actually useful. She had not thought about it as anything other than a practical decision. She understood immediately that she had been wrong about that. She heard Wade say more clearly this time, Eli, I don't want her going through this house like she owns it, Eli said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word in the way that teenage voices do at the worst moments, sliding from anger into something more exposed. She doesn't own anything here. She's nobody. There was a silence. Clara set the pen down very carefully. She kept her eyes on the ledger. She heard footsteps, and then Wade came into the kitchen. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll put the pitcher back," she said, before he could speak. "Clara." It was a practical decision, not a personal one. I should have thought about it. She stood and picked up the pitcher. "I'll put it back." She carried it upstairs. Eli was in the hallway at the top, arms crossed, watching her come up with an expression that was trying very hard to be hard and not quite managing it. He was 14, she reminded herself. 14 and motherless and suddenly required to share his house with a stranger. His anger was the least surprising thing she'd encountered all week. She walked past him to the landing, to the small shelf painted blue that sat at the top of the staircase, and she put the pitcher back exactly where it had been. Then she turned and faced him. "You're right," she said. "I should have asked before moving anything. This is your home, not mine. That was my mistake." Eli stared at her. He had clearly prepared himself for some version of a different conversation. Defensive, explanatory, adult-managed. "I don't want you here," he said, flat, direct, the cruelty of absolute honesty. "I know," Clara said. "You've made that clear, and I'm not asking you to want me here." She held his gaze. "But I am here, and I'm going to keep doing my job. And at some point you're going to have to decide if you want to keep fighting that, or if you'd rather put your energy somewhere it actually gets you something." She went back downstairs. Her hands were shaking very slightly by the time she reached the kitchen. She pressed them flat on the counter until they stopped. Wade was standing by the back door. He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Do what? Put it back?" "Apologize to him. You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she said. "I was wrong." She picked up the pen and went back to the ledger. "He was rude about it, but he wasn't wrong about the fact of it." There was a long pause. "He's not a bad kid," Wade said, and in his voice was the quiet ache of a man who loves his son and cannot fix what is broken in him. "I know he isn't," Claire said. "That's not what worries me." She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "What worries me is that he's taking on too much, running the emotional temperature of this whole house. That's not his job to do." Wade was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then he said very quietly, "No, it isn't." He went outside. Clara kept working. The pitcher stayed on the blue shelf. But 3 days later, when Eli came downstairs and found her patching the knee of his second pair of trousers, the ones with the tear he hadn't asked anyone to fix, hadn't mentioned to anyone, had just quietly moved to the back of his drawer, he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the trousers in her hands and didn't say anything. He sat down at the table. He ate his breakfast. He left. He didn't thank her, but he didn't say she shouldn't have done it. She counted that. The months had a way of stacking up like cordwood, each one solid and separate and heavy, but gradually forming something bigger. By October, the house was running differently. Not smoothly. Clara was under no illusions about smoothly. The boys still bickered over chores in ways that could escalate dramatically over nothing, and the ranch hit 3 separate crises in the space of 6 weeks, including a fence collapse on the north pasture, a sick cow that required 2 nights of watching, and a dispute with a neighboring property owner named Gus Ferris, who believed strongly that the creek boundary ran 30 feet further east than any of Wade's surveys indicated. Clara got involved in more of it than she'd originally intended to. The Ferris situation was the first. Wade came in from a tense meeting at the property line, looking like a man who has been losing an argument he knows he should be winning, and he dropped a stack of papers on the kitchen table, surveys, old deeds, correspondence from the county office, with the expression of a man who has run out of ideas. "He's got a surveyor coming next week," Wade said. "Ferris. Claims his grandfather's original deed puts the eastern creek boundary inside my current fence line." Clara was peeling potatoes. She wiped her hands and came to look at the papers. She had learned numbers from her mother, who had been quietly meticulous about the household accounts before she died, and she had kept Roy's records for 3 years after that. Not because he asked her to, but because if she didn't, the taxman would show up, and there would be nothing in order and nothing to show. She had a good mind for figures and an even better mind for the kind of fine print that men with Roy's attention span glazed over. She spread the papers out. "This deed," she said, pointing to a yellow document at the bottom of the stack. "When was it filed?" 1861. "And this survey is from 64. She placed them side by side. Look at the reference point they're using for the eastern boundary. They've marked it from the creek bend, not the creek channel. Wade leaned over the table to look where she was pointing. The bend moved, Clara said. Look, this earlier map from the county, from 58, shows the bend sitting about 40 feet further south than it does now. Spring floods in 62 shifted it. If Ferris's original deed was written using the bend as a reference point and the bend is moved, then his grandfather's boundary moved with it, Wade said slowly. Or didn't move, Clara said. Depending on how you read the language, the deed says the eastern bend of Harrow Creek. If the bend moves south, his boundary moves south. Your fence line might actually be in the right place. Wade stared at the papers. He looked at her. How do you know to read it that way? He asked. I kept my father's land records for 3 years, she said. He had 3 boundary disputes in that time. I learned to read deeds the way other people learn to read the weather, because if you don't, something expensive happens. She went back to the potatoes. The surveyor came this following Thursday. Wade brought the 1858 county map and the original deed language, and when the surveyor looked at both, he confirmed what Clara had worked out at the kitchen table. Ferris's claim failed. The fence stayed where it was. Wade came home that evening and told her. He didn't make a production of it, and she was glad. A production would have embarrassed them both. He just stood in the kitchen doorway and said, You were right about the deed. And she said, Good. And that was the end of it. Except that Hector had been listening from the back stairs, and he told Sammy, and Sammy told it to every person who came within earshot for the next 2 weeks, as though it were a personal achievement of his own. The sick cow was harder because it was physical and relentless. 2 nights in the barn with Sammy, who had attached himself to the animal with the complete and irrational devotion of a child who needs something to love that doesn't require explanation. Clara had no experience with cattle medicine beyond what she'd observed and what was written in the almanac she'd carried from her father's house. She did what the almanac said and what common sense suggested, and she kept the stall clean and the cow warm, and she made Sammy go to bed after midnight both nights and stayed herself because she didn't want him to come down in the morning to bad news alone. The cow lived. Sammy hugged her around the middle, sudden and brief and fiercely tight, and let go before she could properly respond, and ran off to tell his brothers. Clara stood in the barn doorway in the cold October morning with hay in her hair and felt something shift inside her chest, small, careful, like a door moving on a rusty hinge. By November, the boys were different with her, not transformed. This was not that kind of story, and Clara would not have trusted a transformation that happened fast, but different. The quality of the silence had changed. Sammy no longer paused at the kitchen doorway to assess the situation before entering. Hector had started bringing her things: a broken harness buckle, a cracked tool handle, the ranch ledger with a question about an entry he couldn't make sense of, with the manner of someone who has decided to treat competence as competence, regardless of where it comes from. Even Eli, who was the longest project by far, had begun to look at her differently. Not warmly, but not like she was an inconvenience to be managed. The reading lessons started by accident. She was at the kitchen table one evening working through a letter from the county assessor, formal language, bureaucratic and dense, and Hector was at the other end of the table supposedly doing something with the rope he was supposed to be recoiling, but he was actually watching her. What does it say? He asked. Tax assessment for next year. They've recalculated the property value based on the creek access. Is it bad? It's not good, but it's not catastrophic. She looked at him. Do you know what a tax assessment is? Hector shrugged in the way of boys who don't want to admit they don't know something. Do you read much? She asked, keeping her voice neutral. Some, he said. Enough. Enough for what? He shrugged again. What does your father want for you? She asked. After the ranch, when you're grown. Hector was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the deliberate honesty of someone who has thought about this and found it uncomfortable. He wants us to run the ranch, he said. But he said once, he said Eli's the one who'll run it, and I should know enough to do something else if I want to. He paused. I think he meant if there isn't enough ranch to go around. That's practical of him, Clara said. And what do you want? Hector looked at the rope in his hands. I want to be the kind of person who knows things, he said. Important things, not just rope things. Clara looked at him for a moment. Sit over here, she said. She moved the letter between them. I'll show you how to read one of these. She didn't plan a curriculum. She didn't sit down and design lessons with a particular outcome in mind. She just answered questions as they came, which meant that Hector ended up learning tax law and surveying terminology and how county governance worked before he got around to straightforward grammar, which was backwards and probably inefficient and also deeply appropriate to who he was. Sammy joined within a week because Sammy joined everything Hector did, and she taught him differently. Through the almanac, through stories, through the David Copperfield with its fallen-off cover, reading it aloud in the evenings after supper with him pressed against her side on the bench, following the words with his finger even when he didn't fully understand them. Eli took longer. But Eli was the one who came to her one cold Saturday in December with a letter in his hand from a boy in town, a school friend, and held it out to her without a word, and she understood from the way he held it that he couldn't read all of it, had possibly never been able to read as well as he'd wanted anyone to know, and that asking her was costing him something significant. She took the letter. She read it aloud. She handed it back. She did not make anything of it. She did not look at him in a way that acknowledged what had just happened. She went back to what she was doing. He came back the next evening with a different letter. That was how it started. The ranch's finances were the last territory she moved carefully into, and the most important one. Wade had been managing them himself since Nell died, managing them the way a man manages something he doesn't fully understand, which is to say, he kept current on the immediate bills and failed to see the slow problems building in the background. Clara found them gradually in the way you find damp rot in old wood, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small places that kept appearing, and then you put your hand on the wall and feel how far it has spread. The feed contracts were the worst of it. He had been locked into a supply agreement from 3 years ago that had seemed reasonable at the time, and was now significantly above market rate, with a penalty clause for early exit that was opaque enough he might not have known it was there. She brought it to him on a Tuesday evening in December, when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet. She put the contract on the table and sat across from him and told him what she'd found. She kept her voice even. She did not soften it past usefulness. There was a point at which softening became condescension, and she wasn't going to do that to him. He read through the sections she'd marked. He was quiet for a long time. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Not catastrophic," she said, "but it's been costing you about $12 a month over fair market for 2 years. That's close to $300 you've spent that you didn't have to spend." Wade sat back. He rubbed a hand across his face, and in that gesture, Clara saw the exhaustion and the weight of everything he'd been carrying without enough hands to carry it. "I didn't read it closely enough," he said, "when I signed it." "You just lost Nell," she said. "You were managing a ranch alone with 3 boys, and you signed a feed contract that looked reasonable. That's not a character failure." He looked at her. It was expensive. "Yes," she said, "but fixable." She slid another paper across to him, the letter she'd drafted to the supplier, outlining the market rate discrepancy and proposing a renegotiated rate. "I've written this out. You'd need to sign it. They may say no, but they may not." He read the letter. He read it twice. "You wrote this yourself?" he asked. "This afternoon." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she did something that ran slightly outside the category he'd placed her in. Not surprise exactly. Something more like the quiet recalibration of a man revising a theory. "The wording here," he said, pointing at the second paragraph, "that's legal language." "I read a lot," she said. "Deed disputes leave an impression." He looked at the letter for another moment, then at her. "Clara," he said. "Yes?" "I owe you more than I'm paying you." "You're paying me fairly," she said. "I'm paying you what I'd pay a housekeeper," he said. "You're doing—" He gestured vaguely at the letters, the ledger, the 3 months of accumulated evidence spread across his kitchen table. "Considerably more than that." Clara looked at the table. She looked at her hands. "Let me finish the winter," she said. "Let me get through the rest of the accounts and see what else is there. Then we can talk about it." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. He signed the letter to the supplier. They said yes to the renegotiation. The $12 a month stayed in the ranch's account, and Wade looked at the improved ledger at the end of January the way a man looks at a horizon that has cleared after a long stretch of poor weather, with a cautious relief, not quite trusting it yet, but willing to look. There were still hard things. There were still mornings when Clara came downstairs and stood in Nell's kitchen and felt the full weight of being a stranger in borrowed space. There were evenings when she went to her small room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and asked herself what exactly she was doing here, and whether she was building something real or just postponing a different version of the same problem. There were nights when she heard one of the boys crying, Sammy sometimes, very quietly, in that way children cry when they think no one can hear. And she stayed on her side of the wall because she was not their mother and would never be their mother, and she knew the difference between being present and overreaching. But the house was running. The accounts were improving. The boys were reading, all three of them, in their different ways and at their different paces. The ranch was getting through the winter in better shape than it had gotten through the winter before. Clara was not happy. Not yet. Not in any complete way. She was something that preceded happiness, something more qualified and careful. She was useful. She was seen. She was not, for the first time in as long as she could clearly remember, waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Outside the kitchen window, the cottonwoods stood bare against a gray February sky, their branches holding the cold with the patient certainty of things that know spring is coming, even when spring seems very far away. Clara heated water for the morning's washing and watched them and kept going. Spring came to Delwood the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with a warm week followed by a hard frost, followed by 3 days of mud that made the roads nearly impassable. By April, the creek was running full again, and the fields had gone from dead gray to the particular yellow-green of new grass, and the ranch was moving into its busy season with something it hadn't had the previous year: a functioning set of accounts, a renegotiated feed contract, and 3 boys who could all, to varying degrees, read the morning paper. Clara had been at the Callahan Ranch for 8 months. She noticed the shift in how the town looked at her gradually, the way you notice weather changing, not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small signals. The way Mrs. Aldridge at the dry goods store had started addressing her directly instead of past her. The way the teller at the county bank, a thin, precise man named Perkins, had begun including her in conversations about the ranch accounts rather than waiting for Wade to confirm everything she said. The way some people in town, mostly women, had started nodding to her on the street with the particular nod that meant you have been assessed and found acceptable. Others had not. The Hargrove family was the most visible among those others. Margaret Hargrove was the wife of the largest landowner in the valley, and she had the social authority that came with that position, the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself because everyone in town already knew it was there. She was a woman in her 50s, sharp-eyed and immaculately dressed even on ordinary Tuesday mornings, and she had formed an opinion of Clara Whitmore sometime in the previous autumn, and had seen no reason to revise it. The opinion, as best Clara could piece it together from fragments of conversation and the careful non-reactions of people who liked her well enough, but not enough to pick a side, was approximately this. Clara was Roy Whitmore's daughter, who had been offered in a drunken bargain and taken in by a widowed man under ambiguous circumstances, and whatever practical function she served at the Callahan Ranch, her presence there reflected poorly on the household and on the valley generally. Clara had known this. She had managed it, more or less, by staying on the ranch and out of town, except when necessary. Wade handled most of the supply runs. When she did come into town, she kept to her business and came home. The mistake was the spring market. It was the first Saturday in May, and the market was the biggest social event of the season. Every ranch family in a 20-mile radius, goods and livestock, and the kind of concentrated community interaction that happened only a few times a year. Wade had asked her to come because he needed help with the accounts on 2 livestock purchases he was considering, and because Sammy had asked, specifically and repeatedly, whether Clara was coming, in the way Sammy asked for things he wanted, which was by asking the same question in slightly different configurations until the answer changed. She had agreed. The market was loud and crowded and smelled of animals and sawdust, and the particular combination of food and wood smoke that Clara had always associated with the times in her childhood when things had briefly been all right. The boys spread out immediately upon arrival with the efficiency of children who have attended this event every year of their lives and know exactly where everything is. Wade stayed beside her, close enough to be present, far enough to give her space. He had a way of doing that, she'd noticed, of calibrating his proximity to what the situation required without making a statement of it. They were at the livestock pens looking at a pair of yearling steers that one of the Brennan brothers was selling, when Clara heard her name, not spoken to her, spoken about her, in the carrying voice of someone who either didn't know how sound traveled in an open space or didn't care. "That's her," Margaret Hargrove said, and Clara did not need to turn around to know the voice. "The Whitmore girl, still out there at Callahan's. I heard she handles his books now." This was a younger voice, one of the Hargrove daughters, Clara thought. Agnes, the older one, who was 23 and recently engaged and very eager to demonstrate that she had her mother's judgments. "She handles whatever he lets her handle." Margaret's voice carried the precise weight of implication without ever crossing into accusation. That was the skill of it. Roy Whitmore's daughter, doing the accounts for a man living alone. Draw your own conclusions. "Poor Wade," Agnes said. "He was so desperate after Nell." "Desperate men make poor decisions," Margaret said. "That's not news." Clara's hands had gone still on the fence rail. Behind her, she heard Wade's breath change. A barely perceptible shift, the controlled stillness of a man deciding whether to turn around. "Clara," he said quietly. "I heard it," she said. "We can go." She turned around. She was not entirely sure what she intended when she turned. Not a confrontation exactly, but she couldn't stand with her back to it either. Couldn't pretend she hadn't heard and walk away with that pretense sitting on her for the rest of the afternoon. Margaret Hargrove was standing about 15 feet away with her daughter and two other women Clara recognized from town. She was dressed in a gray jacket that probably cost more than Clara had earned in her first 3 months. And when she saw Clara turn and look directly at her, her expression didn't change. That was the remarkable thing. It didn't sharpen or soften or show any recognition that she'd been caught in anything. Clara held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. She turned back to the fence. She said to Wade in a level voice, "The left one. He's carrying more through the shoulders. He'll put on better weight by fall." Wade looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the steer. "You sure?" "The right one's right knee is tracking slightly off. He'll be fine for grazing, but he'll have trouble with rough terrain by winter. Your north pasture has 3 rocky sections." She pointed. "Left one." Wade was quiet. Then he turned to the Brennan brother and said, "I'll take the left one." She did not look back at Margaret Hargrove, but she heard the slight pause in the conversation behind her, and she knew that her failure to flee had registered. It wasn't over. She had understood that even before she turned around. They were at the dry goods table near the market's south entrance 2 hours later when it happened properly. Clara was looking over a bolt of practical brown wool. The boys needed winter trousers, and May was not too early to think about it, when she became aware that the conversation around her had shifted, had acquired a kind of collective held-breath quality. She looked up. Margaret Hargrove was walking toward them with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the point of carrying it out. Her husband, a large solid man named Daniel Hargrove, was beside her, looking like a man who has been told this was necessary and is participating without enthusiasm. Wade was 3 steps to Clara's left, talking to the dry goods merchant about pricing on feed sacks. He hadn't seen them yet. Margaret stopped directly in front of Clara. "Miss Whitmore," she said. Her voice was public now, pitched for an audience, and the market had its audience. People nearby were not even bothering to pretend they weren't listening. "Mrs. Hargrove," Clara said. "I want to say something to you directly," Margaret said, "because I think clarity is kinder than rumor." She glanced at Wade, who had turned and was now watching with a controlled expression that told Clara he understood exactly what was happening. "This valley is a community. People here have standards they've worked to build and maintain. When someone arrives under particular circumstances, it reflects on all of us how we respond to that, what we accept, what we normalize." Clara said nothing. "I'm not casting judgment on your personal situation," Margaret continued, which was a remarkable sentence given that she was doing exactly that. "But I think it would serve everyone, including yourself, if you considered your position more honestly. You arrived here with nothing, under circumstances that everyone in this town knows. The kindness Wade Callahan showed you was just that, kindness. And there's a difference between accepting kindness and making yourself a permanent fixture in a home where you have no proper place." The silence around them had gone absolute. Clara could feel the heat in her face. She could feel the particular shame of being publicly reduced, the way it worked its way under your skin, even when you knew it was unfair, even when you knew the person doing it was wrong, because shame was not rational and did not care about what you deserved. She kept her hands at her sides. She kept her face still. She was about to say something, she didn't know what, something careful and measured that would cost her nothing and concede nothing, when Wade stepped forward. He stepped up beside Clara, close enough that his arm was against her shoulder, and he looked at Margaret Hargrove and he said, "Are you finished?" Margaret blinked. "Not much, but enough." "I was speaking to—" "I know who you were speaking to," Wade said. His voice was completely level. Not cold exactly, but stripped of any social warmth, any of the neighborly accommodation that usually lubricated these interactions. "I was standing here while you did it. So was half the market." He looked at her directly. "I'd like to say something back, if that's all right." Margaret's chin came up. "By all means." "You said Clara arrived here with nothing, under circumstances everyone knows." Wade's voice was still level, still carrying. "That's true. She arrived with almost nothing because her father tried to trade her future for bar debt, in front of witnesses." A pause. "I was one of them." The market was very quiet. "In the 8 months since then," Wade continued, "she has reorganized my household, managed my accounts, identified a $300 overcharge in a supplier contract, saved a calf that my boys would have been heartbroken to lose, and taught all 3 of my sons to read properly, including Eli, who I thought was just going to keep pretending he was fine until it became a real problem." He stopped. He looked at Margaret with an expression that was not angry, but was completely, quietly final. "She has done more for this family in 8 months than most people do for anyone in a lifetime. And she has done it while living in a community that has spent that same time deciding what to make of her." Agnes Hargrove made a small sound. "The particular circumstances of how she came here," Wade said, "were not her choice. They were what happened to her. And the fact that this town has spent 8 months treating her for what was done to her, instead of for who she is—" He stopped. He seemed to weigh what he was going to say next against some internal measure. "I think that says more about us than it does about her." Margaret Hargrove stood very still. Her husband, Daniel, was looking at his boots. Clara could not look at Wade. She was looking at the bolt of brown wool in her hands and pressing her fingers into it hard enough to feel the texture in her fingertips. And she was concentrating on that because her eyes were burning, and she was not going to cry in front of Margaret Hargrove. She was not going to give the woman that. "I see," Margaret said finally. Her voice had changed. It had gone careful in the way of someone recalibrating on the fly, someone who has pushed something and felt it push back harder than expected. "Well, I meant no offense to you personally, Wade." "I know," he said. "That's part of the problem." He turned away from her. He looked at Clara. "You want that wool?" he asked. Clara cleared her throat. "Yes," she said. 2 yards. "Then let's get it measured." He turned to the merchant. Around them, the market noise slowly came back. Voices and movement resuming the way water flows back into a space after something has moved through it. People were looking at Clara differently now. She could feel it the way you feel a change in temperature, not seeing it directly but aware of it on your skin. Some of them looked away when she caught their eyes. A few did not. Mrs. Aldridge from the dry goods store was standing near the fabric bolt. She reached out and touched Clara's arm as she passed. Quick, light, the kind of touch that means something but doesn't ask for anything in return. "Good wool," Mrs. Aldridge said, nodding at the bolt. "It'll wear well." "Thank you," Clara said. They found the boys at the food tables and walked back to the wagon together, Sammy talking continuously about a dog he had seen near the livestock pens and his evolving theory that they should get a dog, Hector carrying a sack of apples he had traded for with money from his own small savings, Eli walking on Clara's other side in the particular silence of someone who has processed something difficult and is still processing it. When they reached the wagon, Eli helped load the packages without being asked. As he straightened up, he looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not soft, not dramatically changed, but honest in a way that was new. "What she said," he started. He stopped. "You don't have to—" Clara began. "She was wrong," Eli said. Flat, direct, the same manner he'd used to tell her he didn't want her in his house 8 months ago. Only now the words were pointed in a different direction. She was wrong about you, about all of it. He climbed into the wagon. Clara stood by the wheel for a moment with the brown wool under her arm and the afternoon sun on her face and the sounds of the market behind her. Wade came up beside her. "You all right?" he asked. The same question he had asked her at her father's kitchen table 8 months ago, and it still had the same effect, that particular disarming simplicity. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I will be." He nodded. He didn't push it. They drove home in the early evening, the wagon moving slow on the soft road, the boys gradually going quiet as they got further from town, and the valley opening out around them in that way it did at this hour, the light going low and golden across the grass. Clara sat in the front seat and looked at the road and thought about what Wade had said. Not the words themselves, she had heard those, but the fact of them, the decision behind them. He had stood in front of the most socially powerful woman in the valley, in front of an audience, and said something true. He had not calculated it first, or if he had, the calculation had been fast and certain. She did not know what to do with that. It was a bigger thing than she had room for yet. Sammy fell asleep against her shoulder somewhere on the last mile, his weight settling against her with the absolute trust of a sleeping child. And she held very still and let him sleep and looked at the road and did not try to figure out everything at once. The ranch came into view around the last bend. The cottonwoods were in full leaf now, bright green against the evening sky. The barn was lit in the last of the sun. It looked, from a certain angle, like a place worth coming home to. Clara had been careful not to think of it that way. She was finding it harder, lately, to maintain that care. When the wagon stopped at the house, Wade lifted Sammy down without waking him and carried him inside. And Hector and Eli took the horses to the barn, and Clara stood in the drive for a moment in the quiet that followed. The real quiet of the ranch. Not the loaded silence of the first weeks, but something settled and earned. Inside, she could hear Wade moving, the familiar sounds of the house absorbing them back. She looked up at the sky, which had gone deep blue in the east while the west was still burning amber. The first star was just appearing, the same low, bright star that had appeared on her first night here, 8 months and a world ago. She thought about Margaret Hargrove's voice, carrying its practiced certainty. She thought about the way the market had gone quiet. She thought about Eli's face when he'd said she was wrong, and the way he'd said it with the same directness he'd once used to tell her she wasn't wanted. She was not foolish enough to think that one afternoon changed everything. The valley had its opinions, and opinions had gravity, and Margaret Hargrove was not a woman who reversed positions easily or quickly. There would be more of this. There would be more Tuesdays in dry goods stores and more loaded silences and more conversations happening just past the edge of her hearing. But something had shifted. Something in the public record of who Clara Whitmore was had been amended in the middle of the spring market, in front of enough witnesses that it couldn't be quietly revised away. She had not amended it herself. That sat with her in a complicated way. She was not certain she should have let someone else do it for her, should not have found the words herself. But she had been standing there with shame already moving under her skin, and Wade had stepped up beside her, and what he'd said had been true. And she was not sure she could have said it the same way. Someday, she thought, she would say her own words in her own voice in her own time. She had not done it today. But she was learning. She went inside. The house smelled of wood smoke and the mutton stew she'd left warming on the back of the stove, and one of the boys had left his boots in the middle of the hallway again. She stepped around them without looking. She knew whose they were by the size. And the lamp in the kitchen threw its familiar yellow light across the floor. She hung up her coat. She went to the stove and checked the stew. Tomorrow the ranch would need its ordinary work. The accounts, the mending, the lessons, the 1,000 small functional tasks that kept the place running. The extraordinary afternoon would recede into the background and the daily life would reassume its weight, which was mostly what life was. The space between the dramatic moments, the long ordinary stretch of showing up. Clara stirred the stew. She set out the bowls. The ordinary work was fine. She had always been good at it. But now, tonight, in this kitchen, she let herself notice something she had been carefully not noticing for 8 months. She didn't want to leave. Not someday, not eventually, not in the unexamined way of someone who simply hasn't yet made other arrangements. She didn't want to leave. This house, these boys, this complicated and unresolved life, she wanted to stay in it. She had not decided what to do with that. For now, she set out 5 bowls instead of 4 without thinking about it, the way you do something that has simply become true, and she called the boys to supper, and Wade came in from wherever he'd been, and they all sat down together in the kitchen light. Summer came in hard that year, the way it had the summer before, though this time Clara met it differently. She knew the rhythms of the ranch now, knew which week the creek would peak and begin its slow retreat, knew which fields Wade would rotate to summer grazing and which he'd rest, knew the particular complaints of the water pump before it gave trouble, and how to address them before they became an emergency. She was not a stranger in the house anymore, and the house knew it. The walls had absorbed her presence the way old wood absorbs weather, not without resistance, but permanently. The boys had changed in ways that were easier to see from the outside than from within the daily texture of it. Sammy had grown 2 inches and lost 2 more teeth, and had the confident ease of a child who has decided that his world is fundamentally safe, which was not how he'd seemed when she arrived. Hector was reading everything he could get his hands on: the almanac, the county newspaper, a battered book on animal husbandry that Wade had owned for years without opening, a worn copy of something called the Practical Farmer's Legal Guide that Clara had found at the back of the county land office and brought home for him because she recognized in its subject matter exactly the kind of knowing important things he'd told her he wanted. Eli was 17 in August, broader in the shoulders, quieter in a different way than before, not the closed quiet of a boy keeping people out, but the considering quiet of someone beginning to form his own views and taking them seriously. They were not her sons. She had never confused herself about that. But they were hers in some real, unnamed way that she had stopped trying to find the right word for. Wade was something else she had stopped trying to find the right word for. What had shifted between them was not dramatic. There had been no single moment that changed the register of things. It had happened the way the ranch's finances had improved, in increments, in small recalibrations, in the accumulated evidence of a year and a half of daily proximity and mutual respect. He listened to her. Not in the way of a man humoring someone, but in the actual way. He changed his mind when she made a good argument. He deferred to her judgment in areas where her judgment was better than his. He told her things about the ranch and about himself that had the quality of things that hadn't been said aloud in a long time. She caught him looking at her sometimes in a way that was not the look of an employer assessing a useful employee. She did not know what to do with that and had been deferring the decision for several months. It was the middle of August when Roy Whitmore came back. She saw him from the kitchen window. She was standing at the counter doing nothing in particular, taking a moment between tasks, which she allowed herself more often now than she used to, when she saw the shape of a man on foot coming up the drive. Something in the walk registered before she consciously identified it. The particular hitch on the left side. The way he moved like a man who has spent many years being heavier than he currently was. She set down the cup she was holding very carefully. She had known he would come eventually. Not known in the specific sense of having expected it at any particular time, but known in the deeper way of someone who understands how certain situations resolve. The ranch had become visible. Its improvement was the kind of thing people talked about. And Roy Whitmore was the kind of man who appeared when there was something to appear for. She went to the back door. "Wade," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. He was at the workbench near the barn, replacing a cracked spoke on the small wagon wheel. He looked up at the tone of her voice. "Someone's coming up the drive," she said. "My father." Wade set down the spoke. He looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face, she supposed, though she wasn't sure what was there to read. Then he wiped his hands on the cloth hanging from the bench and came toward the house. Roy Whitmore had reached the gate by the time they both came around to the front. He was thinner than Clara remembered, which was saying something because he'd been lean before. His beard was fuller and less tended. He was wearing a coat that was too heavy for August and boots that needed resoling. He looked like a man who had been having a difficult year, and Clara noticed that she felt very little about this beyond a flat, clinical acknowledgement of the fact. He saw Clara first. His expression went through something complex. Surprise, maybe, that she was the one who came out to meet him, or surprise at how she looked, standing in front of a working ranch in good clothing with her hair done properly and her chin level. Then he saw Wade behind her, and his expression settled into something more practiced. "Clara," he said. "Papa," she said, "you're looking well." He said it like an observation rather than a compliment. His eyes moved past her to the house, to the barn, to the general evident condition of the property. Place is looking good. What do you need? Clara said. Roy's eyebrows went up slightly. It was not the opening he'd expected, apparently. He'd expected something. Not warmth exactly, but the particular residual deference of a person who has spent years being shaped by someone else's authority and hasn't fully shed it yet. He adjusted. He looked at Wade. Wade Callahan, he said, extending a hand. Been a while. Wade shook it. Roy. I was hoping to talk, Roy said. He looked at Clara. Both of you, I guess, or just the two of us, if... Whatever you have to say, you can say to both of us, Clara said. Roy's jaw moved slightly. He nodded. All right. He looked around, at the yard, the barn, anywhere but directly at her. I've been having a rough stretch. The property went. The bank took it back in March. Tax situation got away from me. He paused. I've been in Cheyenne, working where I can. Clara waited. I'm not here looking for trouble, Roy said. I just thought, you've done well here, clearly, and I thought maybe there was room for some kind of arrangement. I can work. I'm not past it. If there was something on the ranch that needed doing, or even just... No, Clara said. Roy stopped. There's nothing here for you, she said. Her voice was level. She had imagined this conversation in various forms over the past year and a half, and in some of those imagined versions she had said things that were sharp and satisfying, and in others she had said nothing at all, and in all of them she had felt more than she currently felt. The reality of him standing in front of her was strangely deflating. He was smaller than the version of him she'd carried. Not a job, not an arrangement, not anything else. Clara. I'm not angry at you, she said, and as she said it she realized it was true, which was surprising. I was. For a long time I was very angry, but I'm not anymore. She looked at him directly. You tried to trade me for $37 of bar debt. I think about that sometimes. I think about who you must have thought I was to believe that was something you were entitled to do. Roy's face had gone still. I know things weren't easy, she continued. I know Mama dying made things harder for you. I know the farm was failing for years before that. I'm not saying your life was simple, she paused. But I was your daughter, and the only thing you ever saw when you looked at me was what I cost and what you could get for me. That's the truth of it. And I've spent a year and a half learning what it feels like to be seen differently, and I'm not... She stopped, found the next words. I'm not going backwards. Not for anything. Roy looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wade. You got something to say too? He asked, and there was an edge in it. The edge of a man who's been refused and is looking for someone to blame it on. Not much, Wade said. He had his hands in his pockets and his voice was perfectly even, the kind of even that costs something to maintain. She said it right. I'm her father, Roy said. I know who you are, Wade said, and I know what happened in your kitchen 14 months ago. I was standing in the doorway when it happened. A pause. You've got no claim here, Roy. Not on the ranch, and not on her. Roy's expression went through something then. A complicated sequence that Clara watched with the detached attention of someone watching weather pass over a distant ridge. Anger, yes, but under it something that might have been shame, and under that something else she couldn't name. Something that looked almost like the recognition of a man who has arrived at a destination and found it smaller and worse than he'd imagined. He looked at Clara one more time. I made mistakes, he said. It was not quite an apology. It was the statement of someone who has decided that acknowledging a thing is the same as addressing it. I know, Clara said. Your mother would have... Don't, she said, quick and clean. Don't use her. She's been gone 12 years. Leave her out of this. Roy closed his mouth. He stood there for another moment in the August heat, and the situation had run its course, and everyone knew it, and there was nothing left to do but the leaving. I'll go, he said. All right, Clara said. He turned. He walked back down the drive toward the gate, that hitching, uneven walk, the coat too heavy for the season, the boots that needed resoling. Clara watched him go. She stood and watched until he reached the road and turned south, toward town, and disappeared around the long bend. Wade was standing beside her. He hadn't moved. You all right? He asked. The third time he had asked her that. She was beginning to understand it was the question he used when other words weren't sufficient. Yes, she said, and this time she meant it completely, without qualification. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the counter and breathed. Then she started on supper. The boys came in from their respective corners of the afternoon. Sammy, from wherever he'd been with the dog he'd eventually worn Wade down into acquiring, Hector from the backfield, Eli from the barn. None of them had been around for the conversation at the gate, but they all read the quality of the evening the way children who have grown up reading households always read them, and they were quieter than usual and careful in the way of people who understand. Something has happened without knowing exactly what. After supper, when the younger boys had gone upstairs, Eli stayed at the table. He sat with his hands around his cup the way his father did, elbows on the table, and he looked at Clara clearing the plates. "Was that your father?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Is he coming back?" Clara considered the question. "No," she said. "I don't think so." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. He got up and carried his own plate to the basin and went upstairs. Clara stood at the basin for a long time after the house had gone quiet. The evening had cooled, and through the open kitchen window came the smell of cut grass and the sound of the creek, running lower now in mid-August, but still running. The dog was asleep on the porch with the particular boneless abandon of dogs who have found their place. She washed the plates. She put them away. She had been doing this for 14 months, and it still wasn't entirely natural, and she thought it probably never would be in the way things were natural when you were born into them. It was a different kind of belonging, harder won, less assumed, more conscious. You knew what it cost because you'd priced it yourself. Wade came into the kitchen. He'd been outside after supper the way he often was, doing the last walk of the evening around the perimeter of the property, checking fence, checking stock, the final accounting of the day that ranchers did the way other people said their prayers, a ritual assurance that things were as they should be. He sat down at the table. He looked at her. "I've been thinking," he said. Clara hung up the dishcloth. She turned to face him. There was something in his voice, not new exactly, but uncovered, like something that had been under a surface that was now removed. "All right," she said. He looked at the table for a moment, then up at her. "I've been thinking about the arrangement, what it is." He paused. "What it should be." Clara kept her hands at her sides. She waited. "You came here as a housekeeper," he said, "and you've been that, and you've been considerably more than that, as I think I said once to someone who needed to hear it." A slight pause. "But the word housekeeper isn't the right word anymore. I don't think it's been the right word for a while." "No," she said carefully. "I don't suppose it has. I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't make it sound like—" He stopped. He seemed genuinely uncertain, which was rare enough in him that it changed the quality of the room. "I don't want you to think I'm asking because it's practical, because of the ranch or the boys, or because you manage the accounts." "What are you asking?" she said. "I'm asking if you'd want to stay," he said. "Properly, permanently." He met her eyes. "I'm asking if you have any interest in making this, what it's already become, in being honest about what it is." Clara looked at him across the kitchen, in the lamplight. In this house she had learned room by room, in this life she had rebuilt from the bones of nothing. "I need to say something first," she said. He nodded. "I didn't come here looking for this," she said. "I came here because there was nowhere else. And for a long time I was very careful not to want anything beyond the practical arrangement because wanting things had never worked out particularly well for me." She paused. "I'm not easy to live with. I have opinions and I express them, and I've been wrong often enough that I'm not arrogant about it, but I'm not going to pretend I don't have them. I don't know how to be unobtrusive." "I know," he said. "And I'm not Nell," she said, saying the name carefully as she always did. "I'm not going to be her. I don't think you're asking me to be. But I want to say it plainly." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anyone but who you are." He looked at her with the steady directness he had, the quality she'd noticed from the very first day, the way he looked at things squarely. "Who you are is what I'm asking about." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a night bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. "Yes," Clara said. Wade was quiet for a moment. Yes, which part? He asked. All of it, she said. Something in his face shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwrought, just the subtle easing of a man who has been holding tension in a place he didn't realize until it was gone. He stood up. He came across the kitchen and stopped 2 feet in front of her, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her sometimes for months, except now there was no reason to look away from it. I'm not easy either, he said. I close up when things are hard. I work instead of talking. I've got 3 sons who are all in some stage of becoming complicated people, and that's going to be a lot. I know all 3 of them, she said. I've been here for 14 months. I know you have. I patched Eli's trousers. Something came across his face then. Warm and sudden and real, the kind of expression that isn't performed. You did, he said. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the silver in his hair in the lamplight, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the evidence of everything his face had lived through. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. Very gentle, very simple. The gesture of someone who has been wanting to do a small thing for a long time and has finally decided the wanting is enough reason. They stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, just standing, nothing resolved yet, and everything beginning. Then Sammy's voice came from upstairs. Is there any of that cornbread left? Clara stepped back. She pressed her lips together against the laugh that was trying to come out. There is, she called up. Can I have some? In the morning, Wade said. A pause. What if I'm hungry now? You're not that hungry, Wade said. A longer pause, the negotiating silence of a child assessing his options. Fine, Sammy said, and his footsteps retreated. Clara and Wade stood in the kitchen and looked at each other. And this time the laugh came out of her, quiet and real. And he shook his head slowly with that expression she had come to recognize as the closest he usually got to laughing himself. It was not a perfect evening. Roy Whitmore was somewhere on the road south, and that was its own loose end that hadn't fully resolved. There were questions still ahead. Practical ones about what the new arrangement meant and how it would be managed, and how the boys would receive it, and what the town would say when it knew, which it would know, because towns always knew. Margaret Hargrove would have opinions. There would be more of all of it. Clara stood in the kitchen of the Callahan Ranch on an August evening and looked at the man who had stepped into her father's doorway on the worst afternoon of her life and asked if she was all right. She looked at the room that had been someone else's and had slowly, stubbornly become partly hers. She thought about the door she had closed today. Not slammed, not angry, just closed, with the quiet finality of someone who has decided what goes on which side of it. She was 20 years old. She had arrived here with nothing and had built something piece by piece in the way you build things when you have to learn as you go, imperfectly, with mistakes, with days that nearly broke her and days that surprised her and the long ordinary stretch of days in between. She wasn't finished building, but she was no longer afraid of the work. She put the kettle on. The night settled around the house. The cottonwoods held the dark, patient as ever, and the creek ran in its low, late summer voice, and the dog shifted on the porch, and somewhere upstairs 3 boys were falling asleep in rooms that had learned to hold them. The lamp burned steady in the kitchen window. They were married in October, 6 weeks after the evening in the kitchen, in a ceremony so small that the word ceremony was almost too large for it. The justice of the peace, a spare older man named Aldous Crane, who had been doing this job in Delwood for 22 years, came out to the ranch on a Thursday morning. Eli stood on Wade's left. Hector and Sammy stood on Clara's right, Sammy in the clean shirt he'd been threatening to grow out of for the past 4 months. The dog sat on the porch and watched through the window. It took 11 minutes. Afterward, Sammy said he thought there should have been cake, and Clara made one that evening, not because the occasion demanded ceremony, but because Sammy was right that there should have been cake. They ate it at the kitchen table, and Hector said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten, which was an overstatement, but the kind of overstatement that comes from genuine feeling rather than flattery, and Clara accepted it as such. Eli said nothing about the cake, but he ate 2 pieces, and when he caught her looking at him, he looked back without looking away. And that was its own kind of statement. The town found out within a week, because towns always found out, and the reaction was exactly what Clara had expected, which meant It was a mixture of things. Some people were genuinely warm. Mrs. Aldridge brought a jar of preserves to the dry goods counter the next time Clara came in and said simply, "Congratulations," with the directness of a woman who means what she says. The bank teller Perkins shook her hand with an enthusiasm that suggested he had somehow taken her success personally. Several ranch families who had gradually come around over the past year expressed their approval in the practical, understated way of people who demonstrate feeling through action. An extra load of split wood left at the gate, a recommendation passed along to another rancher looking for accounting help. Small things that added up to recognition. Margaret Hargrove said nothing, which was itself a statement. Clara encountered her twice in the months that followed, and both times Margaret was civil in the careful, calibrated way of someone who has revised a position without wanting to announce the revision. It was not warmth. It would probably never be warmth. But it was an absence of hostility, and Clara accepted that as the realistic outcome it was. She was not going to get an apology from Margaret Hargrove, and she had made her peace with not needing one. What mattered more, in the daily texture of her life, was what happened inside the ranch's gate. The first year of the marriage was not simple. She had known it wouldn't be. Wade was exactly the man she told him he was back in the kitchen. He closed up under pressure, went into himself, spoke less when he should have spoken more. There were weeks in that first winter when the ranch hit problems that stacked on each other. A late blizzard that drove the cattle through a weakened fence section, a sick season that went through the whole household and left everyone depleted and short-tempered for 3 weeks. A disagreement about the spring planting rotation that became, briefly and irrationally, about something else entirely. Clara was not easy either. She had her own scar tissue, her own places where she pulled back when she should have stayed present. There were moments when she heard an edge in Wade's voice. Not cruelty, nothing like cruelty, just exhaustion or frustration wearing the wrong tone. And something old in her went very still and very careful, and she had to remind herself where she was, who he was, that those were different things. They argued sometimes. Not often and not badly, but with the genuine friction of two people who both had strong opinions and were learning which ones were worth the fight. She won some of those arguments, he won others. A few of them resolved in the middle, which she thought was the most honest outcome of any argument between people who are actually listening to each other. He learned to say what he was feeling instead of going quiet. It took him most of that first year, and he wasn't consistent about it. And sometimes she had to ask directly. But he learned. She watched him learn it the way she'd watched the boys learn to read. Imperfectly, with backsliding, with the occasional moment of breakthrough that made the whole slow process worthwhile. She learned too. She learned to stay in a room when her instincts said to leave it. She learned that some of her certainty was genuine and some of it was the armor of a person who had needed to be right because being wrong had always been expensive. She learned the difference slowly. Eli turned 18 in August of the second year and announced, in the careful way he announced things, that he wanted to study land law. He had been reading everything he could find on the subject, some of it from books Clara had pointed him toward, some of it from correspondence with the county land office, some of it from the memory of watching her sort through deed language at the kitchen table 2 winters ago. He wanted to go to the college in Cheyenne. Wade was quiet when Eli said it. Clara watched Wade's face and saw there the particular complex expression of a father being surprised by who his son has become, proud and uncertain, and aware that the surprise is partly on him for not having seen it coming. "It's expensive," Wade said. "I know," Eli said. "I've looked at it. I've got 3 years before I'm old enough to apply. I can work the ranch summers. If I can save, we'll figure it out," Clara said. Both of them looked at her. "The accounts are in better shape than they were when I got here," she said. 2 more years at the current rate, and we can fund a year's tuition without compromising the operating budget." She looked at Wade. "If he works summers, and we set aside what we can." Wade looked at his son. Eli looked back at his father with the restrained hope of a 17-year-old who has taught himself not to want things too openly. "Land law," Wade said. "Yes," Eli said. "That's—" Wade stopped. He pressed his lips together for a moment. "That's a good field to know." "I thought so," Eli said. Clara looked at the table. She did not make anything of the moment, which required some discipline because the moment was considerable. Hector, true to the direction he'd been heading since he was 11 years old, took an interest in the business side of ranching with an intensity that occasionally alarmed his father. and never alarmed Clara, who had seen it coming from the week she'd shown him how to read a tax assessment. By 16, he was managing the feed contracts himself, with her reviewing his work, and by the time he was 17, he had renegotiated one of them entirely on his own, with a result that saved the ranch $40 a year. He told her about it at the kitchen table, not triumphant exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose theory about themselves has been confirmed. "You should have done the talking," she said. "Not me, not your father, you." "I did," he said. She looked at him. How'd it feel? He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to all questions. "Like I knew what I was doing," he said. "That's the right feeling," she said. "Hold on to it." Sammy was the one who surprised her most in the end. Sammy, who had been the easiest and the most open and the least complicated of the three. Sammy, who at 12 told her, in the matter-of-fact way he told things, that he was glad she'd come to live with them. "Why?" she asked, which was a genuine question, not false modesty. "Because you made things work," he said. "Before you came, things didn't work right. Dad was tired all the time, and Eli was trying to fix everything, and Hector was worried, and I didn't really know what was wrong, but I knew something was." He shrugged, with the loose ease of a child who has accepted a complicated history. "You made things work again." Clara was quiet for a moment. "The things that work," she said carefully, "are because everyone in this family did the work. Your father, your brothers, you." She looked at him. "I helped, but the material was already here." Sammy considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "Okay," he said, "but you helped a lot." She accepted that. 4 years after the evening in the kitchen, the Callahan Ranch was a different proposition than the one Clara had first walked onto. The accounts were solid, the livestock operation had expanded carefully, the reputation in the valley had shifted from a widower's struggling property to one of the more reliably run ranches in the region. Wade had a standing offer from 3 different buyers every spring and declined them all. The land was his, and he intended it to remain so. The valley had changed too, and Delwood with it. New families had come in. The railroad spur that had been rumored for years was finally under real construction 15 miles south, and the economic pressure that brought had already begun reshaping what the town cared about and who it listened to. Margaret Hargrove was still Margaret Hargrove, but the social architecture she operated in had shifted around her in ways that diluted her influence. She was still someone in Delwood. She was no longer the only someone. Clara found herself consulted. Not often at first, and then more regularly, by ranch wives and townswomen who needed help with accounts or contracts or the particular kind of reading between legal lines that she had taught herself out of necessity. She helped where she could. She charged fairly when money was appropriate and didn't charge when it wasn't. She did not set out to build a reputation. She set out to be useful, which she'd always known how to do. And the reputation followed the usefulness the way it generally does when you're not chasing it. There was a morning in late September. The boys were older, the house was different. A small addition had been built off the east side to accommodate what had quietly become a larger household. When Clara was standing at the kitchen window in the early light, the cottonwoods were going yellow. The creek could be heard from the house this time of year, running full with the autumn rains. Wade came in from the morning round and stopped in the doorway the way he did, taking in the room. The smell of coffee. The ledger open on the table where she'd been working before she stood up to look out the window. The domestic evidence of a life. He looked at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She almost said nothing, the old reflex. Then she said what she was actually thinking. "I was thinking about my mother," she said. "She used to stand at windows." She paused. "I think she was doing what I'm doing, just taking a moment, before the next thing." Wade came and stood beside her. He looked out at the cottonwoods. "She'd have liked it here," Clara said, and then, because she believed it, "she'd have liked you." Wade was quiet. He put his hand over hers on the windowsill. Not a gesture of reassurance, not performing comfort, just presence. Just the simple fact of being next to her. They stood there for a moment in the early light. Clara had thought about her life. The shape of it, what it had been and what it had become, more than she told people. She thought about what it meant that the worst afternoon of her existence had been the turn that led her here. She did not think this was justice exactly, or a reward for endurance. She didn't believe life organized itself that neatly. She had seen enough people endure without being rewarded to know that suffering did not guarantee anything on the other side of it. What she believed was this: you made choices inside the circumstances you were given. Some choices were made for you. Her father's hand on her future, the drought, the accidents of where and when and to whom she'd been born. But inside those constraints, there had always been something that was hers. The pause before she turned around, the refusal to look away, the decision to get into the wagon, the decision to stay. The choices accumulated. They formed something. Not a perfect thing. Nothing she'd built was perfect, and she trusted the imperfection as a sign of its reality, but something durable, something that held. She thought about the girl who had stood in her father's kitchen with her hands balled at her sides and said no in a voice steadier than she felt. That girl had not known what she was doing. She had only known what she would not accept. Sometimes that was enough to start with. It had been enough. Eli came home at Christmas in his second year at Cheyenne, broader and more certain of himself, with the particular quality of a young man who has found the field where his mind works best and has begun to really inhabit it. He sat at the kitchen table and told her about a case study he'd been assigned. A land dispute with a boundary problem very similar to the Ferris situation from 5 years ago. And she listened and asked questions, and he answered them with an expertise that had passed hers, and she felt about that the way she supposed a teacher felt when a student went beyond them. Not diminished, completed. "You know," he said, at some point in the evening, "I didn't want you here." "I know," Clara said. "I was a problem," he said. "You were 14 and your mother had been gone a year and a stranger showed up in your house without warning," Clara said. "You were exactly as difficult as the situation warranted, not more." Eli looked at her across the table. "I want to say I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said at the beginning." "Eli, I know I don't have to. I know you've said it doesn't matter." He held her gaze. "It matters to me." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Okay?" she said. "I hear it." He nodded. Something settled in his face. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it. The reading, the trousers." A slight pause and something almost like a smile. "All of it." Clara looked at this young man who had been a closed-off, grieving boy of 14 when she first saw him, who had told her flatly that she was nobody and that she wasn't wanted, who had handed her a letter he couldn't read all the way through and trusted her to say nothing about it. "You did the work," she said. "I just handed you the material." He shook his head slowly, the way his father shook his head. That same gesture, absorbed over years of proximity. "You sound like Dad," he said. "Probably," she said. "We've been living in the same house for 5 years." He laughed at that. A real laugh, easy and unguarded, and she held the sound of it the way you hold the things that cost you something to earn. The years were not without their difficulties. No years are. There were dry seasons and hard winters, a year when the cattle market dropped and the accounts required creative management, and the ordinary wearing work of raising 3 sons into 3 separate complicated adults, each of whom needed different things at different times and was not always able to say so clearly. There were mornings when Clara woke up and felt the old flatness, the residue of all the years before this one, deposited in her somewhere and not entirely removable, just reduced and more manageable with time. She had learned not to expect the feeling to be gone entirely. She had learned to get up anyway. She stood at the kitchen window on a September evening 5 years into her marriage. The cottonwoods golden, the creek running, the smell of the season turning, and she looked at the valley she'd come to know, the way you know a landscape you've watched through all its moods and weathers, and she thought about worth, about what it meant. She had grown up in a house where her value was calculated by what she could do for someone else, by what she cost and what she could be exchanged for. That calculation had been so thoroughly internalized that she hadn't even known it was a calculation. She'd thought it was just the truth of what she was. It had taken years to understand that worth was not decided by the people around you. It was not granted by being seen correctly or defended publicly or married well or praised. It was not something you received. It was something you built. In the ordinary daily work of showing up and doing it honestly and staying when it was difficult and choosing, again and again, who you were going to be. She had built it here, imperfectly, without a plan, making mistakes she'd had to own and adjustments she hadn't known she'd need. She had built it in ledger books, and in a sick cow's stall, and in the reading lessons at the kitchen table, and in the conversation at the gate, and in the 11-minute ceremony, and in 5 years of ordinary mornings. Wade came out onto the porch behind her. He stood beside her in the evening light, the same way he'd stood beside her for years now, not requiring anything, not filling the silence with noise, just present. "Sammy wants to know if you're coming in," he said. "What does he want?" "He says it's important." "Is it?" "He says the dog has done something notable." Clara turned from the valley. She looked at her husband, at the lines around his eyes, at the silver that had spread through his hair, at the face she had learned the way you learn something you rely on. "I'm coming," she said. She went inside. The lamp was lit in the kitchen. Sammy was crouched on the floor with the dog, who had apparently done something involving the corner of a feed sack and was extremely pleased with himself. Hector was at the table with an account book, pausing to observe the situation with his characteristic analytical expression. Eli's coat was on the hook by the door. He was home for the week. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and the remains of supper and the particular warm smell of a house that has people living in it who intend to keep living in it. Clara sat down at the table. She looked at the account book Hector was working on. She reached over and pointed out an entry. "That one's miscategorized," she said. Hector looked. "You're right," he said, and fixed it. Wade sat down across from her. Sammy began explaining the dog situation in considerable detail. Eli came down the stairs and went directly to the stove to see if there was anything left from supper. Outside, the cottonwoods held the last of the evening light. The creek ran in its patient voice. The valley lay quiet and vast under the turning sky. Clara Whitmore. Clara Callahan. Now, though she thought of herself by both names still, because she had earned both, sat in her kitchen in the middle of her life and listened to the voices of the people she had chosen and who had chosen her back, and she felt, with the quiet and unadorned certainty of something true, this was enough. This was, in fact, more than enough. It was not the life that had been planned for her. It was the one she had made. That was the difference, and the difference was everything.
Guess I want to turn it back. How's the tiny sack hanging today? It's hanging. It's definitely hanging, Mr. Merlin. What do I get here? I'm gonna get this, and then final item, Frozen Heart. Call it a day. I think that'll be a good build. I have ult for this one, so I guess I'll just play with play topside.
It's like 3 right here.
Yeah, Leo's top.